My name is Gordon Bonnyman. I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee on July 16th, 2019 to interview my friend Neil McBride. This is being done as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Would you state your name for the record, please?
For the record, I'm Neil G. McBride, current resident of Knoxville, Tennessee.
And when were you born and where?
I was born on December 12th, 1945 in Dallas, Texas.
And why were you born in Dallas, Texas?
My father was in the Army. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers. And after the war, his first posting was building air bases in that area. And we stayed in Dallas for a short time. I have no memory of it, but that's why.
Okay. And your mother, I assume you were born there because she was there as well.
Yes.
and what is your dad's name?
He's Francis Gerard McBride. In the end of his career, he was Colonel McBride.
And where was he from?
He was born in the Bronx. And both my mother and my father had a number of coincidences in their lives. And one of them is that both of them lost their fathers when they were very young children. My father actually before he was born, and my mother a little bit later. So he grew up as a child of a single woman in a very poor but stable household in the Bronx.
And when was he born?
1917.
And your mother, where was she from?
She was from Virginia. And as I said, her father died, and her mother, they had relatives in the Norfolk area. So she grew up primarily around Norfolk.
And what was her name, her maiden name?
Frances Virginia Solomon.
So you had two parents named Francis?
I do. One with an E and one with an I.
And when was she born?
1920.
And how did they meet?
They both went to college at the University of Alabama. My dad went there on a football scholarship, and from having played at Fordham Prep, which at that time was a powerhouse of high school football. And he actually played on the same team with Bear Bryant in college. And my mother went there, I think because it was the furthest place that her grandmother and mother would let her go to.
And did your dad stay in touch with Bear Bryant?
Well, actually, neither one of them liked him very much. My mother was what they would call in those days a great beauty, and was featured in the yearbook with a full-page picture of herself, and was in a sorority with the woman that Bear was going out with and ended up marrying. And he would regularly, what we would say today, hit on my mother to the displeasure of both my mother and my father.
Interesting backstory. And you had siblings?
Yes, I have an older brother, Michael, about 4 years older than me, and a younger brother, Rick, who's 3 years. Michael is 3 years older than me, and Rick is 3 years younger than me.
And you had a peripatetic existence growing up.
We did. The longest time I ever spent in a place until I moved to Jacksboro, Tennessee, was 3 years in the Netherlands. My dad had an interesting career. A lot of his work was more advisory or diplomatic than it was construction. So we were in the Netherlands about 7 years after the end of the war, and he was advising the Dutch government on their recovery after the war. And then while we were there, they had a 500-year flood that he was deeply involved in, killed thousands of people. And then he had other positions that were not your typical kind of military job.
And do you have any memories of the Netherlands?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, it was, as I said, the longest place I lived. And in many ways, I've been back to our old house several times with my children and my wives, sort of taking them to old. I often take my children and my former wife and my new wife to old home places.
Of which you have a number.
We do.
Do you remember the Great Flood?
I do. Dad was away a lot. My older brother, who was probably then, I want to say 8th grade, was allowed to go to Scheveningen, which was very near where we lived, outside The Hague, and help fill sandbags. And they wouldn't let me do that in the 4th grade for a very good reason as I look back. But at that time, it was a big disappointment that I couldn't go with my brother Mike and help on the flood.
And these were the floods that prompted the Netherlands to sort of redo their whole flood protection.
And not just the Netherlands, but all of Europe got much smarter about how to handle water.
And are your earliest memories of The Hague? Do you have any memories before that?
Actually, I have memories of Tampa, Florida, when I was about 2 or a little over 2. And I told my mom one time, I had this vision of me crying on the sidewalk outside the house that we lived in. And I basically said, what was that about? And she said, you'd just been bitten by a Cocker Spaniel. We had to take you to the hospital, which I didn't remember. My one memory was on a tricycle, on the sidewalk, crying because I couldn't get in or something.
So after the Netherlands, I assume that you did not live in military housing, base housing.
Every now and then we would. When I was in 1st grade, we were in a military base in Fort Meade, Maryland, where my father was the head of this. This was 1951. And he was the head of the Civilian Loyalty Review Board for the Army. And
is that as ominous as it sounds?
Yes. Yes.
Was his heart in it?
We didn't talk about it a lot, but I got the idea it was just something that he was assigned to do.
And you were how old when you were at Fort Meade?
Oh, 1st grade.
And
5 years old, something like that.
And did you learn Dutch?
We moved from Fort Meade to the Netherlands, and I knew enough to get around and get on a bus and get off at the right spot and things like that.
What kind of school did you attend?
An international school in The Hague. Americans, British, English-speaking Europeans, and some Dutch kids.
And you moved from there to where?
To Portland, Oregon, where he was the deputy district engineer for the Northwest. And at that time, they were finishing damming the Columbia River. And one of my childhood memories was being taken out to the construction project at one of its final closing stages and jumping across the Columbia River.
Oh my goodness.
Which had been reduced to about 3 feet.
I'm glad you got to do it then.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And then how long were you in Portland?
For 2 years. And then we moved to Fort Belvoir, and we lived in the city then, not in a base. And then we moved to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, outside of Washington, and lived there for another 2 years. Went to 7th grade and what was then an 8th grade level of a high school.
And were you at a military school? I mean, a base school?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And you moved from there to Virginia Beach, I think?
Yes. We lived a year in Virginia Beach while my dad was in Korea, sort of building things after the war. And then moved to Tokyo, Japan for 2 years.
What was your living situation there? Were you on a military base?
We were. We were the only family on the base. At that time, his career moved into mapping, and he was the head of the Army Map Service for the Far East. And their main job was to map Vietnam in preparation for what they knew would be the war. And this is 1960, 62. And I used to play basketball with soldiers who were on mapping crews, guards for mapping crews in Vietnam, who died. And it's always been a little frustrating to me that the wall in Washington has a cutoff date, which didn't include a lot of soldiers doing their job in the country in the very early 60s who were ambushed or died in combat.
Did you attend a military base school?
Yes.
There?
Yeah, we were the only family on my little mapping base, but I had a chauffeur who took me me and my brother, who took me to an Air Force base that had a school, and I was there for my 10th and 11th grade.
And did you have much interaction with the Japanese?
I would ride subways back and forth. We would go out a lot on our own. Not as much as I should have when I look back.
Had the occupation as such ended at that point?
Yes.
Was this a period when there were concerns about communists in Japan and the snake dances and that sort of thing?
Well, there were huge demonstrations in Tokyo about U.S. involvement in Japan and other sort of foreign policy issues. And so as you left the base, the air base where my school was, there would be a sign on the door, on the gate going out, telling you which parts of the city to avoid that day because of demonstrations and general unrest.
Did you ever encounter any hostility, overt
Nothing
hostility?
personal. And I would often take the subway back home from my school. My friends and I would take subways into Tokyo. And we always felt safe.
And then you finished high school, I believe, at Alexandria. Is that right?
Right. For my senior year, I went back to the school where I had gone in the 8th grade. And so I knew some people there, and it was not quite as difficult to transition as it might have been otherwise.
That's a lot of moving around.
Yep.
Did you resent those moves, or did you find them difficult, or was that just sort of what you knew and that was the norm?
Well, it was what we did. Because we lived away from military bases much of the time, I would be kind of unusual going into a school. But for over half the time, I was in a military or sort of international environment where all the kids in school were as mobile as we were. And so it wasn't like, here's this new guy. What do we make of him? It was, we all come and stay 2 or 3 years and leave. And so it was not as alienating as it might be if we had just gotten uprooted. And it's a little ironic because I ended up spending virtually all of my adult working life in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as did my children. And they are still best friends with kids who were in our play groups before kindergarten. And, I can count on 4 fingers the number of people that I know are even still alive after the 5th or 6th grade.
I imagine that in Oak Ridge, you had the same experience that many of the people, if not most of the people there, were also relocated from other places, and there was a lot of
right.
new kid in the school phenomenon.
People had moved there, but the ones that really were doing the work in the lab, the workers themselves and the scientists tended to stay. And so there was a substantial number of people who, like us, spent their whole lives there. So,
was there in this long list of different places that you lived growing up, was there a place that felt the most like home?
Virginia was most like home because that's where my mother was from, and that's where I had been in school at different times. And we were in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington. And so I think about myself as a Virginian. But when I think about sort of the house and the impact of growing up, the 3 years we spent in The Hague was pretty important.
And what did you take away from that in terms of worldview or awareness of a larger world?
I think the whole family really had, as we would have to have a fairly, what I would call ecumenical view of the world, and not so rooted in local ideas or local ways of life.
I imagine also that family life might have been particularly important, mm-hmm. just because you had each other and that was your nucleus that you might not be able to expand that much beyond your immediate family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You went to Hamilton College?
I did.
Before Bill Purcell.
Right.
And our Nashville mayor. What led you to Hamilton?
Well, at one point, my father had and I forget where it fit in his career, he was looking at ROTC programs, maybe during the war or right after it, I'm not quite sure. But he had visited that area, and it always had a positive feeling toward the school. And you will appreciate this. My brother went to Princeton, and that was my first choice. And they chose not to admit me. And Hamilton just seemed to fit.
And did it?
Yes. Yeah. Looking back, I would have preferred a larger school and a co-ed school, but it was, I had some very good experiences.
I can see you were misinformed about Princeton. You would have been disappointed there. What did you major in?
English.
And what were your intentions career-wise when you were an undergraduate?
I wasn't that thoughtful. I liked literature. I liked the chance to read literature and get credit for it. I had vague ideas of being a teacher of some kind, but I also knew that it was a major that had a lot of writing. And Hamilton was really known for emphasizing writing in all of its courses, but especially in English. And then it also required a class in public speaking, and all of the classes involved presentations to classes. So again, English was just a personal interest that I took, that knowing that it would help in writing and speaking.
And when did you first think about going to law school?
My kids hate to hear me say this, but when you first filled out a kind of career form when you got admitted, when you came to the school the first month, they asked you what your plans for graduation were. And it had a little bitty line about an inch long. And I put down law because it fit in the space and I knew how to spell it. And so every year after that, I would do the beginning of the year meeting with the counselor who would say, well, I see you want to go to law school. So I said, sure.
Did you know any lawyers?
No. My uncle, my great uncle, who I have the middle name of, was a lawyer in Norfolk and Richmond, Virginia. So
This was your mother's
my
brother?
mother's brother.
Did you know him?
I did. I'd met him several times. So I had a little sort of direct understanding that people could actually do that. But and while I was at Hamilton, I developed a real interest in kind of public affairs and the law just seemed to fit in with that by the time I graduated.
And what year did you graduate?
In 1967.
A lot was going on then.
Yep.
Were you involved in any political activities?
Not in college. There was a very small group. I mean, Hamilton in total only had about 800 kids in it. But there was a very small group that was involved a little bit with the student movement and some political events. But for the most part, we were fairly insulated and isolated. But it was still, I would call, an alert campus, so we knew what was going on. And then when I got to law school, there was really more activity and I got more involved with, I would say, public events.
So you get to senior year in college, you fill out the short LAW statement on the form again, because that's the shortest thing. At some point, did it occur to you that you might actually have to take the LSAT or apply or do something else to take it to the next level?
Yes. By my senior year of college, I had determined that was what I wanted to do.
And what drew you to it?
It was two things. I really liked the intellectual challenge that law offered, the ideas that the law as a field deals with. And I liked the idea of having a skill that would let me be involved with public events or sort of public interest activities.
And how did you choose where to go to law school?
Well, same way I chose college. The University of Virginia was the best place that accepted me, and I went there. I convinced them to accept me as a Virginia resident. I did this long memo on my father's placement and my mother's history, because technically you couldn't be a Virginia resident and therefore get a lower tuition and a lower standard of admission. But anyway, they finally wrote me and said they would be pleased to welcome me as a Virginian. It was really an extraordinary place.
And at this point, the war and the draft were first and foremost for our generation, the Vietnam War. What was your draft status, and how did you navigate all that?
I had a student deferral, of course, through Hamilton, and then got called for a physical while I think it was during my second year in law school, and the law school was. I didn't want to join the Army, but I was prepared to join if I got drafted, but it wasn't an affirmative interest that I had, forgetting the war or anything else. And so I spent some time in the JAG school, which was right behind the law school, the Judge Advocates General School, where the Army lawyers all went to train, and read the rules about deferments and sort of medical exemptions. And in fact, I had broken my ankle climbing Mount Fuji in Japan. And it was a serious break, but it was not, I was not in a wheelchair by any means. But I got all the records, all the information, and I knew how that fit in with the medical deferment, and went to a physical down in Roanoke and went through the whole thing. And the doctor at the end said, "Neil, do you want to join the Army?" And I said, "I will serve if I'm called, but I don't want to join if if the injury to my ankle might might put people I was with in the field in danger, or put me in unnecessary danger. And so this is not something I want to do." And first I'm thinking, is this a trick question? Is this guy out to get people that don't want to do it? And he said, "I understand," and gave me the medical deferral.
And what was a deferral or a deferment?
I forget the exact title of it, but in the event of a bigger national emergency, I could have been called up. So it was any rate,
it was a category in which you were passed over
right.
for the draft, at least for the time being.
That's right.
And did you ever hear anything more from the draft board or
No.
the military?
No.
And you developed this interest, obviously, in social justice, public interest, advocacy. Where did that come from?
A lot of people would think this was counterintuitive, but my father in the Army was a public servant, and he really believed in the work he did. He wanted to do it well. He thought about what he did, and it wasn't just going through the motions, looking for promotions, whatever people do. And I think that was just fundamentally a kind of an example that I wanted to follow.
And what was your relationship with your parents? Were you all close?
We were very close, but not. I look back now and see my children with me, and I'm thinking, I talk with them every day. I wish I would have done more of that with my parents, but that may have more to do with cell phones than family dynamics. But we were close, but not. We really weren't involved with people's lives every day or every week.
And was there any tension between you all over politics or career choice?
We would talk about it, and my father respected what I did, but and understood that I had reasons for doing what I did. I think they were mainly when I started going into positions that were not, traditional, well-paying legal positions. I think their concern had more to do with making a living and being stable than the politics of my choices.
You said a moment ago that UVA was an exciting place when you were there. Tell me about that.
Well, there were two strains to it. Overall, as you would expect, it was a very conservative place. Most of the students there were Virginian. Most were relatively conservative, or really I would call them traditional.
And let me interrupt just for a second to set the context. This was only a few years after Virginia's massive resistance to school desegregation.
Yes.
In which they basically shut down the public schools rather than integrate.
Yeah.
And so the political context in the state in the years that you were there would have been quite conservative.
Yes.
Excuse me, go ahead. So that's one strain, and the other strain.
Well, the other strain was there was a core of people who had very strong beliefs in public interest law and legal aid. And as a result of their relationship to the overall student body, they, I think, became more determined in their beliefs and sort of stuck together and supported each other more. And so we had a strong community of people that believed in public interest law. A number of them went to work with legal aid in different parts of the country. Interestingly, a number of them became real strong health advocates, and I tended to room with and hang out with some people that went on to some pretty extraordinary careers in public interest and public service.
And who are those folks, if you can just give us examples?
Well,
and what do you mean by public interest?
Sure. I mean, one of my roommates was a man named Mike Fox, who went out to work for California Rural Legal Assistance as a migrant advocate, and became one of the real leaders and experts in the field in the country, and then became a judge in Washington, in Seattle. And one of the active leaders of setting up a legal aid program at the law school was Angus King, who became governor of Maine and senator from Maine. And another roommate was the director of a huge program that covered South Central Virginia and Lynchburg. So
a legal services or
right,
legal aid program.
Right. And you probably know Lucian Wilson, who was in my class and was I started with National Health Law, I think. And,
That's right.
So, it was a good group that supported each other. And I cannot forget, although I almost did, Elaine Jones was in our class.
Was she the first African-American woman at the law school?
Yes.
And spend a moment talking about her.
Oh, you can't do it in a moment, but she became general counsel to the NAACP, handled a case book full of appellate cases and Supreme Court cases. An amazing leader in the legal civil rights field.
Basically, she took the place of Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, known as the Inc. Fund.
That's right. And there are others who are, it was a good group.
That sounds like an extraordinary who's who. So you graduated from law school in 1970?
Mm-hmm.
And what did you do out of law school?
During the summer after my second year, I went to work for the Southern Regional Office of the American Civil Liberties Union and was just a basic law clerk. The Southern Regional Office at that time, and for many years before and after, was run by a man named Charles Morgan, Jr., again, whose career reads like a civil rights case book. He did jury desegregation. He did voter rights cases. The first client I did research for when I got there in the summer was a man who we then called Cassius Clay on his draft case. And
who later became known as?
Muhammad Ali. We worked on an extraordinary range of cases.
Sounds like heady stuff.
It was.
Charles Morgan, I think, was from a traditional privileged white family in Birmingham who got radicalized by the civil rights movement and
right.
and sort of was spurned by his world and entered a new type of legal career.
Right. He basically got thrown out of Birmingham when he spoke out very bitterly about the bombing of the church that killed 4 girls in Birmingham and was just vilified. Any rate, and then he had always done a little bit of public interest work, but that just turned him around.
So this was after your first year of law school that you worked there?
No, that was the summer before my third year. Right. I was just a law clerk for the summer. And stayed in touch with them, but that was a summer job.
And what did you do after the first summer?
When I graduated, I went to
law
school in England, and a law school in Southwest England, and got some credit from university international program.
And that sounds like a nice gig. Was it more than a junket? Did you take anything away from that?
Well, my parents at that time were living in Saudi Arabia, and my dad had left the army, was working for the Raytheon Corporation, and they would pay dependents way to Saudi Arabia once a year. And so I could get my airfare to England for free, and then I went to visit them at the end of the school term. So it wasn't quite as extravagant as it might have seemed.
Did you take anything particular away from that experience?
I confess, not really. I got a good look at housing law in England and some other comparisons, but not really.
And so after you graduated, you took the D.C. bar exam, or the Virginia bar exam?
Yes.
And then you used that to gain admission to the D.C. bar as well.
Right. I was a member of D.C. and Virginia, but it was a little different. My first job after law school was essentially another summer clerkship. And during this school year, during my third year, Ralph Nader, who he basically invented the field of public interest advocacy and was the author of Unsafe at Any Speed and
that was about auto safety or the lack
safety,
thereof.
right. And by that time, he had a whole series of small nonprofit firms in Washington that worked in the field of food safety, medical issues, a whole range of other fields. But at any rate, one of his deputies, a man named Harrison Welford, came to school to interview. And
this is the person who subsequently became a U.S. senator from Pennsylvania?
No. That's a different one. He stayed a lawyer in Washington. But anyway, Harrison came down to visit, to interview, and Ralph at that time was the place to work for a student that had any interest in public interest law, and a lot that didn't. He had a very prestigious sort of Ivy League group of lawyers working for him. But so when Harrison came down to visit and interview at UVA, something like 80 students signed up for interviews, and he interviewed people in groups of 15 to 20, all sitting around a table, which is an impossible situation. And I was in the last group of interviews, and you could tell Harrison was just struggling to know what to say and to sort of almost, to stay alert. And so he started the interview by saying, "Well, I see that I have 15 resumes, and there's 16 of you here. Whose resume don't I have?" So I handed him mine and said, "You probably don't have mine." And he looked at it, and again, he's just struggling for something to say. And he said, "Why don't I have yours?" And I said, "Because I didn't think there would ever be a firm here that I wanted to interview with." And the bottom line is, me and one other person got jobs that summer. And he had the top students of my class and the class below applying. And, but again, he later on, he became a friend, and he said, that was the only thing I remembered from that whole day was your comment about your resume. So at any rate, I got a job working with what we called the Savannah River Project, which spent a summer in Savannah looking at the relation between politics and big corporations and pollution, where the Union Camp Corporation, a paper mill, dominated the city. And in fact, the city council, an elected democratic body, had for years a Union Camp seat. And so when the Union Camp executive got transferred back to a plant in Virginia or wherever else they had paper mills, his replacement would join the city council. And that's just a little picture of the role of that industry in the city. And so we released a book at the end. The leader of the team was a man named Jim Fallows. And Jim and I wrote a book called The Water Lords. And it was a really exciting and very productive thing to do.
What came of it?
The city council stopped having the Union Camp Corporation seat. And actually, Union Camp really got its act together in terms of reducing pollution on the Savannah River. And there were some other things like that took place, just because we were really the first group to take an overall look at what the city had become.
So this would have been one of the early environmental justice cases or projects,
we didn't do any litigation. We filed a couple complaints on some issues that we found, but we weren't doing litigation. It was basically investigative reporting and analysis.
And the book, The Water Lords, was it for a mass audience or was it a technical?
No, it was a popular book.
Did it sell well?
It sold like his other books. There was what I would call an avid small audience. Didn't make the bestseller list, like most of his didn't, but because he had groups that summer and afterwards that wrote more than a dozen books on different topics like that.
And what became of Fallows?
He went on. Actually, he lived in Washington when I did later on. He worked for the Washington Monthly. He was the press writer. He was speech writer for Jimmy Carter, and did some other things in the middle, and then became the national editor of the Atlantic magazine.
And so it's that Jim Fallows.
It is.
Did your
And I'll just add one more note about the Savannah group. One of the other members of our team there was a lawyer named John Williams, who had just gotten out of who was in his third year, between his second and third year at Vanderbilt Law School. And maybe we'll talk about later, I ended up working with him in Tennessee several years later.
And he went on to become a Nashville lawyer.
Right.
Did you ever consider a traditional legal career?
No.
Even when you applied to law school, that wasn't why you were going.
Right, right.
Was there a single person or event that influenced your orientation towards public interest law?
You know, I would have to say it was the overall experience of working with Chuck Morgan in Atlanta and watching what he was able to accomplish. And I'm not going to go through his case list, but he did Reynolds v. Sims, One Man, One Vote. He did some amazing work. And he was a genius at using the law and the press, and then sort of political engagement in achieving what he wanted to achieve for his clients. And that was a real lesson, and it was extraordinary to see what they could accomplish in the field of public interest law. And you know, I had a much bigger part in some of that work than I would have had in a law firm. And it's not that I respected good lawyers, and I really respected good law firms that have contributed to their communities and been important institutions for the country, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I mean, just as an example, one of the cases I worked on was a student who had been discharged from Tennessee A&I.
Now known as Tennessee State University,
Yes.
Tennessee Agricultural and Industrial
Exactly.
School.
Yeah. And they were going through some typical, but I would say mild student unrest at the campus. And our client was somewhat of a leader, but he wasn't a rock thrower or anything like that. And he got expelled. And so we challenged the expulsion and basically said, we went into federal court and said the handbook, which they based the expulsion on, said you can be expelled for this offense and that offense and that offense and any other offense that would justify expulsion. And we thought that was void for vagueness. And while I was in my third year in law school, that case got before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I drove up from Charlottesville after getting permission from my professors to skip class that day, all of whom were just amazed that I, a sort of average student, was involved in any way in a case before the U.S. Supreme Court. It just showed me how, in addition to all the sort of personal feelings about what you could accomplish, public interest law typically allowed people who were looking for experiences to do much more than they could normally do in a private practice or as a corporate lawyer.
And what is your definition of public interest law?
It's vague. It's a focus on issues that will strengthen the well-being, safety, and kind of development of the general public. I haven't really thought about that in that way. But it's a very broad field. And there are people that go into education law and health law and issues involving access to decision-making and city planning, and certainly environmental and civil rights issues. But
That sounds like social engineering.
Well, at best it could be.
That's not an epithet to you.
No.
Let me push a little bit on your orientation to public interest law, because this episode, working with Chuck Morgan, you were already you were a rising 3L at that point.
Right.
So to take that job, you must have had something that turned you to that earlier. What prompted you to do that?
I think it was just the general set of experiences I had with classmates and some faculty at law school, and then being an observer of that kind of work when I was in college, and then generally thinking about what my dad did and how he spent his career.
And just as an aside, what became of the Tennessee A&I case?
We were the appellants in the case, and
had lost in the Sixth Circuit.
We'd lost in the Sixth Circuit, and Reber Bolt, a Nashville lawyer, was the
This is the younger Reber Bolt.
Yes, yeah, was working with Chuck in the office, and he was lead on the case, and he stood up and started to give the basic presentation of the facts and circumstances of the case, and our argument that a regulation that says you can be expelled for any reason that would justify expulsion was void for vagueness. And Warren Burger, the Chief Justice at that time, interrupted Reber and said, "Counsel, don't you think we could," and I remember his words exactly, don't you think we could excuse the vagueness of that rule if we stopped to consider that it was probably written back in the days when students went to school to get an education? In fact, it was written as a direct response to student unrest in the late 60s, and was a very deliberate and kind of strong message to the students themselves. But Reber was a good enough lawyer to see where things might be going after that, and he made a real brief argument, sat down, and the court dismissed the case for cert having been improvidently granted. So we didn't lose, but they just said, we don't want this at all.
So this was your first job was the Savannah River Project, mm-hmm. and that was a Nader enterprise,
right?
And how long did that last?
That was a summer, and then after that, I went to Washington. I didn't have a firm job. I didn't have a specific job. I had some things I was pretty sure I could do, but I went to Washington and worked with Jim Fallows to complete the book that came out of the Savannah River.
And were you studying for the bar this whole time you were working?
We'd already taken it. At Virginia, you took the bar in February of your last year. Any rate, so I went to Washington and worked with Jim, and then became the Southern director of what was then the Law Student Civil Rights Research Council, which was a group that provided public interest internships to students all over the country. Our headquarters was in New York. we'd raise money from foundations and major donors and then place interns around the country and did some other things like that. And I did that for almost a year, working in an office that was, in fact, part of the suite of offices that Chuck Morgan and the ACLU occupied. So I stayed in touch with them.
I remember I've forgotten the address, but it had all of those organizations. The Klan could have thrown a bomb in that building and taken care of all of its problems across the South.
5 Forsyth Street.
Yes.
The voter education project, and a lot of people were there. Chuck was a fairly, what we would call, sociable guy. And on Friday afternoons, a lot of the civil rights leaders, John Lewis, Andy Young, other people like
Julian Bond,
would sort of hang out and drink. And it was really an exciting place to be.
And so you just got to hang out with them.
Well, I was lurking.
So what your experience with the Law Student Civil Rights Research Council with the not very mellifluous acronym LISCRIC, were there people that you encountered there that were memorable?
Oh, yeah.
I have to say, Neil, you remind me of Forrest Gump. You seem to have been everywhere when interesting things were happening.
Yeah.
So who did you encounter at LISCRIC?
Well, I'm pretty sure that Harrison McIver was an intern in the summer.
Harrison became the
director of legal aid in Memphis. I'm just really, I had 200 interns that summer, all over the South, and I'm just having trouble drawing up specific names, but they were the real leaders of that generation, especially of civil rights advocacy.
Excuse me. In terms of where you placed them, were there people that you dealt with in their placements, like established law firms?
Sure.
or organizations?
And this was before all states had statewide legal aid programs. Where there was a legal aid program, we would do that sometimes. Generally, there would be private firms that did a lot of civil rights work, Ratner, Sugarman, and Lucas. And
this was the first racially integrated law firm in Memphis.
Right. And there were equivalent firms in most of the states in the South. And so we would provide students with jobs there.
Well, we've been going a little bit over an hour. Is this an appropriate time to break?
Sure.
Okie doke. So, Neil, after your experience in Savannah with Jim Fallows, you moved to Washington, I think?
From Savannah, I went to Atlanta.
Oh, for about a year gig
with LISCRIC, where I met my wife, Babs Clark McBride. And then I really took a lot of satisfaction in placing law students and getting to see the best civil rights advocates in the South. But I wasn't practicing. And so, and it was more just purely administrative. So I looked around a little bit, and my friend Harrison Welford, who had hired me during his cattle call interviews at UVA, told me they had an opening in DC with Ralph Nader, and would I be interested in that? And so I went up to interview for that position with him and with Ralph and the other lawyer working with the opening. And they made me an offer. And so I moved up there and joined a new group called the Aviation Consumer Action Project. This is a little bit sad. A family's child died in an airplane crash through some fairly serious negligence of the carrier, got a huge settlement and gave most of it to Ralph to deal with air safety. And it was interesting. Ralph had a lot of similarities to Chuck Morgan. He knew how to use the law, the press, and legislative and public advocacy to sort of push forward his goals on specific issues. And Ralph was still the person to work for in that kind of public interest law in the country. So even though air safety was not my passion, we did the things that I was doing with Chuck in Atlanta. And it was just a terrific legal experience.
And did you have much contact with Ralph Nader?
I did. He, in two ways, we lived on his office. My office was on DuPont Circle, and I lived on Kalorama Street up Connecticut Avenue.
In Northwest Washington.
In Northwest Washington. And I would walk to work. And when I walked to work, I would often meet Ralph walking to work, who lived on, I think, 18th Street or something like that.
Well, he was famously ascetic. He was. Did he just live in a broom closet?
He lived by himself. I was never in his place. But yeah, I mean, he was what people said he was. He was just a monk who deeply and completely believed not only in what he was doing, but the rightness of what he was doing, and was just driven.
And that could be good, but that could also not be good. What was that experience like as working for someone like that?
Yeah. Again, he wasn't my direct supervisor by any means. I was the first lawyer that ACAP had. I sort of set up what it did. I sort of created the way we took in cases and things like that.
ACAP is the Aviation
Consumer Action Project. And I worked with a couple other lawyers in Ralph's sort of overall firm. But he would literally call up at 11 o'clock at night and say, I've just heard from a whistleblower in the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, who says X, Y, and Z, and I want you to look into it. And so I'd do that. But we had a fair amount of leeway in what we took. But again, when I talk about public interest law with students and young lawyers, I really emphasize how because of the small number of people doing the work and the target-rich environment, you end up doing things quickly that you would never do in a normal private or corporate practice. And the first words I addressed to a court of record, may it please the court, were directed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia on an administrative appeal from a case that I didn't start, but that I argued in the appellate court.
I'm sorry, were you in the district court or the circuit court?
This is an appeal from an administrative
to the district court.
To the Court of Appeals.
Excuse me.
Right. And so, again, the first time I argued in court, except occasionally as a defendant, was to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C., which was a lot of pressure, but also exciting.
And how did that turn out?
We lost. And it was a case I inherited, and it was framed in a way that I wouldn't have done. But it was a very, I don't want to go into the details of sort of airline regulation, but it was a very good issue. And ultimately, the practice that we were challenging has been changed.
And was there a major goal of the project?
Just generally to support air safety and secondarily consumer rights in aviation, baggage rules, and what should happen to a passenger when they get bumped. As you can imagine, Ralph traveled a lot, and he was constantly facing, because he traveled 3 times more than most of us did, he was regularly facing the issues that all of us face occasionally. And so after a trip, he'd call up and say, "This can't be right. You got to do something about it."
So either he didn't make legroom an issue, or you all were a dismal failure.
He never got to legroom, although I'm sure it was not the most comfortable environment for him. But again, it was just to go back to the point of having a career and starting a career in public interest law. One of the things that I did was intervene in a National Transportation Safety Board investigation of an airline accident in the Everglades. Every time there's an accident of any significance, NTSB holds an investigation and has a hearing. And the parties are usually the pilots union, the builder of the airplane, the carrier, the operator of the airplane, maybe the flight engineers, things like that. And I was the first public member to participate in an NTSB investigation.
Was this the case where there was a fire in the baggage compartment?
No, this was more mundane than that. This was in the Everglades, a flight from Chicago to Miami, and the wheels down indicator light didn't go on, and the pilots figured out that the bulb had burned out. And so they were behind their dashboard, essentially, there's a more technical name for it, changing a light bulb. One of them bumped the handle off of autopilot, and the plane went down very slowly and landed in the Everglades. And about 130 people died. It was a terrible situation. And again, we were just on absolute new territory. None of them knew what to make of me. I went down alone.
And how old were you?
This would have been 70, 2 probably. So I was 32. No, I was
27.
27, yeah.
And how long were you at the aviation project?
About a year.
And where'd you go then?
Well, I loved the kind of work. I loved the professional challenge. It was too abstract to suit me. And in other words, Ralph would call up with a problem, or we'd read about a problem, and we'd file a suit or a complaint or a request for rulemaking or whatever we do. And then a reply would come out in the court or in the Federal Register or whatever. And there were really no clients. The family that gave us the money was interested, but it was a very abstract way to work. And I mentioned to you earlier that one of the members of the Savannah River Project was a guy named John Williams, finishing up school then at Vanderbilt. And John was working on getting a grant from the Ford Foundation to set up a rural, community-controlled public interest law firm in Jacksboro in East Tennessee. And there was really nothing like it. It was a real stretch for Ford. It didn't hurt that Alexander Hurd from Vanderbilt, who loved what Vanderbilt students had been doing in the coal fields through the Student Health Coalition and some other organizations, basically got us enough money to start up a public interest.
And Alexander Hurd was the president
of
Vanderbilt.
I'm sorry. Yes, he was the president.
And he had connections to Ford.
Well, he was the chairman of the board. And
they took his call.
They take his calls. And the night before our final meeting with the Ford staff, we stayed in Hurd's apartment on Fifth Avenue. A small fact that we somehow let slip during our interview. But at any rate, and we ended up getting support from several other major foundations around the country during the 5 years that we operated.
And I think you expressed to me some notion that maybe the focus on air safety was not reflective of the general hazards of other forms of transportation.
Right. Again, air safety just wasn't my passion, and I was really more interested in doing work that a community needed and kind of could be involved with.
You thought planes were basically pretty safe.
Well, overall they are, but there were real gaps that were caused by money and issues of carelessness. For example, the Everglades crash could have been prevented by what they call a ground proximity warning indicator, which was not a requirement. And now it is.
So you moved to Jacksboro. Why Jacksboro?
Because that's where the group was doing its work. There was a little core of mostly Vanderbilt students who'd been going into the coal fields for years, setting up rural clinics, engaged with economic development. There was an extraordinary amount of community-based activity supported by doctors, law students, nurses out of Vanderbilt. And then people from other places around the country. But it was initially a Vanderbilt initiative.
And where is Jacksboro?
It is about 40 miles, 35 miles north of Knoxville, right on the edge of the Cumberland Plateau. It's not geologically in the coal fields, but it's right on the edge of the Cumberland Mountains.
And what county is it?
Campbell County.
Is it the county seat?
Yes.
And did you live there?
I lived there for 5 years in the same little house. The landlord was so happy that we didn't have junk cars and weren't having parties to trash the place, that in 5 years he never raised our $150 a month rent.
And you were there with Babs?
Yes.
And what was she doing?
She was working with a craft group. She was an artist, a graphic artist, and was working with a little craft group associated with one of the economic development corporations that was one of our clients, and out of Clairfield, Tennessee, which was deep in the mountains, very poor, one of the poorest communities in the state, and was helping them design and market their quilts and other sort of handcrafts.
So you've moved from The Hague to around the country, Tokyo, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Jacksboro.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, we really liked it. It was, we didn't have children at that time, so I didn't have to think about schools, which you don't want to think about, frankly, especially in those years. And there was a community of people that we worked and socialized with. National Health Service Corps doctors, the other lawyers with ETRC,
East Tennessee Research.
East Tennessee Research Corporation, the group that I worked with. Lawyers from the law school and some private counsel in Knoxville. It was a terrific community to be with.
And what's the population?
700.
And
of course, La Follette was right down the road with I think they were up to 3,000, but it was a tiny little town. The group played volleyball every Wednesday night while normal people were at church. It was really a very rewarding time because of the work and the sort of environment and people that we were with. Again, when I talk about being in public interest law, part of the attraction is the people you get to work with. And so, I mean, we all weren't best buddies and didn't all do everything together all the time, but it was a very rewarding community to be part of.
And how did the local folks regard you all?
We were pretty community grounded. So the retired miners with black lung, we were doing a lot of work for. I helped set up a black lung clinic. There was a group of people in the town who really needed what we did and respected it. So we didn't feel alienated. I mean, I was looking back over the course of years. We got sued for barratry. We got sued for solicitation. There were probably a half dozen legal or professional ethics complaints filed against us by opposing counsel, but we had enough contact in the community that we didn't feel alienated.
And before you arrived to take up residence in Jacksboro, had you been there?
I went down and visited for several days when John Williams told me about the opening, and both to be interviewed by our board members and to look around and see if it was something that we wanted to do.
Now, this sketchy ethical past that you just alluded to, multiple ethics complaints?
Yes.
I'm shocked.
Yeah.
Shocked. Just to set this in context, this was before the state Supreme Court created the Board of Professional Responsibility and took over the regulation of the legal profession directly.
Right.
It was delegated at that time to local bar associations. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so, tell me about some of your scrapes with the ethics.
Oh, the opposing counsel in a case we had against a land company for failing to pay taxes, because we got support from foundations and outside people. They accused us of barratry.
And forgive my ignorance, but what is barratry?
Barratry was an old common law cause of action which sought to avoid people paying for litigation as opposed to an attorney-client relationship, which had been totally dismissed in the U.S. Supreme Court case in Ray Primus out of South Carolina. And Edna Smith Primus actually became a legal aid lawyer. But at any rate, and it was totally unfounded, and it was rejected by a chancery court and just thrown out. But that's the kind of thing that we had to deal with.
You said you also got charged with solicitation?
Right.
Was that the same case, or was that a different?
That was a different case. That was, we were challenging a plan by a huge coal company to do a vast strip mine in southeast Tennessee. And we had a group come to us and say, "Can you stop this?" And we said, "Yes, but we will need some more clients." So the group went out and very appropriately talked with neighbors and friends about what was coming and got them involved as plaintiffs in our case.
And
just so we could sort of cover various types of damages that could occur because of this huge 10,000 acre strip mine project.
And what became of that case?
I'm not sure about the details, but I think it was raised with the court that had the case, and it was dismissed.
And this project that you're describing that you all were opposing, you blocked it, right?
We did.
And I've forgotten the name of it. What was the name of it?
The company was Amax.
Which was a huge international mining company.
Right.
And at that time, it would have radically altered. Which counties was it? I don't remember.
It was Ray, Sequatchie, a whole series of counties on the plateau north of Chattanooga. It would have destroyed the water table, deforested huge acres of land. It would have really changed the whole nature of Southeast Tennessee.
And you all stopped it.
Yeah. Us, and then the work of SOCM and Save Our Cumberland Mountains and other local groups in the area that were concerned about it.
And what was the role of ETRC in stopping it?
We were counsel for a lawsuit just challenging the impossibility of their following the pretty minimal regulations that would have governed their work. Even with a skeleton set of environmental protections, they could not have met that.
Because of the terrain or the
circumstances? The terrain, the mining plan, the water table, it just couldn't have been done in compliance with state law at that time.
And did you all win the lawsuit, or were you able to just hold things up long enough for the political forces to be felt?
We won an early motion to dismiss, and then they ended up pulling out.
And as I recall, it was an extremely high-profile political policy issue in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And what years would that have been? It went on for some time, as I recall.
Right. That would have been probably 73 to 75 in that period.
So at this point, you're in your late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've been dropped into a number of different big, high-profile cases, starting with, may it please the court, addressed to the D.C. Circuit Court. Did you have a lot of trepidation? Were you too young and dumb to know that you were out of your depth?
Yeah,
what was going on?
It was basically a young and dumb issue. But more importantly, at ETRC, the East Tennessee Research Corporation, and then later with the legal aid program that we formed, we had extraordinary lawyers. John Williams worked with ETRC from the beginning. Bill Allen joined us about a year after we started. We had some really bright paralegals, and then occasionally we'd have co-counseling from people like Dean Rifkin at the UT. At that time, he was with the UT Legal Clinic, and then some private lawyers. Boone Doherty was a private lawyer in Knoxville who would help us on the cases. They were just amazing to work with. And the most of the legal work that I described, I was not lead counsel on. I was lead on some issues, but John and Bill and outside counsel really did the heavy work. And their case list for those years reads like a 10-lawyer law firm. It was amazing. And we just kind of took it for granted.
What became of ETRC?
5 years after we organized, and we started having more and more difficulty raising foundation money. And we were not in it to build an institution. We wanted to do the work. And even though I'm talking about John and Bill Allen, I did a lot of the work and had some specialties that I dealt with. And I didn't want to spend, I did most of the fundraising, but it got to be too much of a diversion. So about that time, the opportunity to get funding from the Federal Legal Services Corporation came up. And I had one of our law clerks, a woman named Lark Hayes, do a little memo for us on what was permissible under legal aid, because at that time, I just thought you did divorces and evictions, and that was all you could do. And in fact, the rules allowed a very broad range of advocacy. And to make a long story short, we closed down ETRC, applied for and got the federal grant to cover 19 counties, and then started doing very similar work under federal funding. And you would appreciate this because you were there. The directors of the existing program were desperate for me to take over every unserved rural county in Tennessee, which meant I would have been buying desks and typewriters, which is what we were still using, for the next 10 years from Obion to Johnson City. At any rate, I just said, no, we're not going to do this. We'll do the Cumberland Plateau, and did that for the next 25, 30 years.
You said a moment ago that the docket, the case list for ETRC was amazing for the organization's size and the length of time it existed. Apart from the AMAX case, what other cases stand out?
Sure, there was a lot of. One of the interesting things about that area was that the rural health clinics were models for freestanding clinics in rural areas for the country. And we were regularly visited by senators and public policy makers from Washington. For reasons I don't understand, Joan Baez came down one time and toured the clinics. But they were constantly being challenged by local medical associations, which had a lot of authority, and by the state agencies for not meeting regulations in their little rural cinder block clinics that were essentially designed for hospitals. Nurse can't dispense drugs without a doctor on the premises.
Well,
things like that.
A lot of it, if I recall, and as you say, these became modeled for what are now known as federally qualified health centers,
right,
with federal funding. But
right.
This really led the way. And as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the pushback had to do with gender, and because they were aggressive about using nurses and nurse practitioners,
right.
And that was seen as uppity on the part of local old line male physicians,
right,
who had a very traditional notion about what was appropriate.
There was opposition from a lot of different sources, including just private doctors that didn't want to lose their business. And so, at any rate, that's a long way of saying we did a lot of administrative appeals, a lot of work on certification issues, challenging malpractice claims and things like that. That was just one of several areas outside of taxation and environment. And then we would often do things like help a community group get a closed school to be a community center or a source of kind of community support, things like that. And then just a whole series of things involving individual taxation of coal companies, land companies, things like that. We worked on overweight trucks, which were destroying roads in the mountain areas. Trucks,
these are coal trucks.
Coal trucks, yeah, carrying 100,000 pounds that were certified for 75,000, and just making it very unsafe for normal drivers to get to their remote communities.
And did you succeed?
We did. We got action from the state. We got the Tennessee Valley Authority to agree not to pay for coal in an amount greater than the legal capacity of a truck delivering it. A couple days, we all took turns writing down license plates of coal trucks outside the Kingston Steam Plant, a little west of Oak Ridge, and basically just verified who owned the trucks and what they were doing. Sent a letter to TVA, and after a little hemming and hawing, they did the right thing.
What about taxes? You talk about taxes.
Right. The coal companies were basically controlling the way their land was assessed, and we were constantly challenging the valuation that that their land was given by the county tax assessor, which seems counterintuitive, but the counties were they saw themselves as being so beholden to the coal companies that they were afraid to tax them fairly.
The people the lawyers that filed the ethics complaints about you, were they against you? Were they local?
Some were local, some were Nashville based.
And generally, how were you received by the local bar associations and judiciary?
Right. Generally, the local bars were positive. I wouldn't say they were receptive, but they figured out fairly quickly that we weren't taking money from them. They weren't going to be, we didn't do divorces, we didn't do normal evictions, things like that. And they saw that we were not an economic threat to them. And we made a point to introduce ourselves and stay in touch with judges and bar leaders and talk to the associations. And I think politically, some of them were not happy with us, but they learned to live with us.
So you started Rural Legal Services of Tennessee with the federal grant for the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And what year was that?
That was 1978.
And, excuse me, who was your first attorney that you hired?
Well, Bill Allen came with me from Jacksboro, and so he helped start it. And then the first outside hire we had was Lenny Cross, which I think of as the beginning of the Lenny Cross era, because he was a national caliber phenomenal lawyer that made an impact on the area that most people would think we were just making up. And
do any early cases come to mind?
well, funny that you should ask. We spent a couple months organizing the office, developing our systems, buying typewriters, hiring support staff. And then finally, we started seeing new clients. The first day we opened for new client interviews, a woman named Onalia Neal came into the office wanting a bankruptcy. Lenny had come to us with a brief private practice in Colorado, although he'd gone to Vanderbilt. And so we said, okay, Lenny, you interview her, show her how to do a bankruptcy. And Lenny, being the lawyer that he is, said, instead of just handing her the form saying, fill it out, come back when it's done, said, why do you want a bankruptcy? And she basically described a situation of home improvement in which she was cheated by a private contractor who didn't do the work he was supposed to do. And the work was supposed to be paid by the Farmers Home Administration, which, among other things, runs a low-income housing development improvement project in rural areas.
And it's an artifact of the New Deal, isn't it?
Right. And Lenny, coming basically from an urban practice, thought sure that she meant HUD rather than Farmers Home, but quickly figured out this system. And we determined that for whatever reason, Farmers Home had negligently inspected the work on Onalia Neal's house and authorized payment to the contractor. Now, Onalia Neal, elder woman living by herself, a cafeteria worker in the local elementary school in Kingston, doesn't have the resources. So she came for the bankruptcy. To make a long story short, about 3 years later, Lenny was arguing that case before the U.S. Supreme Court.
And the outcome?
Well, when we were preparing for the case, we had moot courts among ourselves. We had a moot court in front of 9 UT law professors. They all solemnly declared that it was a loser. We'd lost in the district court, won in the Sixth Circuit, and then the Farmers Home appealed. And still the professor said, you've got this case that's directly opposite what you're arguing. And if we were you ought to just get the best deal you can for this woman and go away. Thurgood Marshall wrote the opinion, and we won 9-0.
Wow.
But again, that's a little bit about the nature of a public interest practice and what you could end up doing quickly in your career, but also because Lenny was a world-class, incredibly hardworking and smart lawyer.
I'm going to digress here, a big digression, because I just realized there is an anecdote from your Washington sojourn when you and Babs were living on Kalorama that I omitted. And this, again, is a Forrest Gump moment where your life intersected with world events. And in late 1972, after Nixon had gone to China and there was ping pong diplomacy with ping pong matches between the two countries, momentous event in our international relations in which the Chinese opened a legation a few blocks from where you lived.
Just about 1 block.
All right. So that's the stage. Tell me how you interacted with what was going on.
Yeah, this is actually one of my sort of favorite memories from Washington. I just sat down shortly after they had moved into their building, again, a block from where we lived on Kalorama.
And this was international news. I mean, this was huge.
This was as big as the pandas coming to Washington. The pandas caused traffic jams for 3 miles on Connecticut Avenue.
The pandas were sent by the Chinese communists as a goodwill gesture.
Right. When they arrived, it was an international seismic shift, really, because they had been so isolated and so hostile. But at any rate,
and the Cold War with China had been going on since 1948. And we were at daggers drawn forever, and then there was this thawing, and that was huge.
Right. And so, on a whim, I sat down in my office, literally on a yellow legal pad, and wrote out an invitation to the legation, saying, as a gesture of welcome to our neighborhood, we would like to invite 4 of your members to come to our home for dinner. And I sort of told them who I was, where we lived, where I worked, and just said we were very interested in welcoming them to the neighborhood. And I walked up to the front door of the legation and handed them a little envelope with my yellow legal pad invitation in it. And I had a friend at that time who worked on China issues for U.S. intelligence. And I was just kind of joking with him and saying, this is what I did. And he said, very professionally, sort of grinning knowingly, there's a 98% chance that they won't answer you, and a 0% chance that they'll come. And about a week after that, I get a call on my phone at work saying, Mr. McBride, this is so-and-so from the Chinese legation. We would be pleased to accept your invitation for dinner. And so we scrambled around. We had a little sort of basement apartment with windows, just a modest apartment right down the street from them. And I invited essentially my boss from ACAP, a lawyer named Reuben Robertson, and 2 men and their wives came over, and they turned out to be what I would call seasoned diplomats. They'd lived all over the country. One of them had been in South Africa. One of them had been, in Europe. They spoke good English, not polished, but good English. And we just had one of the most amazing evenings of my life. They were just friendly, and they brought this beautiful silk embroidered picture as a gift. And they were proud of this. It was from the East is Red Silk Factory, which Pat Nixon visited during Richard's time in China. Anyway, it was a remarkable evening. And so, I told my friend in intelligence that they actually came, and he was just flabbergasted and sat down. He talked to his sort of experts, and he gave me a very formal, what I would call debriefing on the evening. Who were these people? What had they done? And I was not terribly comfortable with that, but they were really interested because these people were just in their building and not out all the time. And they wanted me to talk with a more expert intelligence person. And I just said, I'd rather not do that. And I don't really know any more than what I've told you. And so, but at any rate, that was a very memorable evening shortly before we left Washington.
Let me go back to rural legal services. You were the executive director.
Mm-hmm.
And did you handle any cases yourself?
I did. Gradually, I ended up being mostly focused on representing nonprofit corporations. So I would be like a house counsel to rural clinics, economic development groups, housing development corporations, a lot of domestic violence shelters. I'd do in corporations. I'd fix issues with the IRS. I'd help them fire people, do all the things that a corporate lawyer would do. And that fit my schedule as a director better than having a caseload in court. But I still worked on a number of cases, including the Block v. Neal case that was in the Supreme Court.
And tell us about that case.
Well, that was the one with the with the woman who had been cheated by a fraudulent home repair service.
Oh, this is the farmer's home.
The farmer's home case, yeah.
Were there unusual nonprofits, ones that stand out that you, or ones that you're particularly proud of, or that were particularly successful?
Yes, partly because of my dad's, I think, history as a construction engineer. I took special pleasure in doing things that got buildings built or that put old buildings back into use. And so groups would regularly come to me and say, there's this abandoned school that we want to use for a shelter, or we want to use for a job training program or something like that. And so I would help negotiate with the county or whoever owned the building to put it back into use. Another Lenny case that I was very involved in, that I took real pride in, was called NAACP versus City of Oak Ridge. And Oak Ridge got a HUD grant, a grant from the Housing Urban Development Corporation, to build some low-income handicap housing. They wanted to put it in the existing Black community in Oak Ridge, which would exacerbate its poverty and racial disparity. And so we pushed them on not doing that, but trying to put it somewhere else in the city. And of course, no one else wanted it. So they tried to send the money back. $4 million, a lot of money at that time. And this was during the Reagan administration and was going to be really one of the last grants of that kind that were going to be given. And so we sued the city, seeking injunctive relief to make them build the housing. And you normally can't force a city to take a grant. But in the housing field, there was an exception where there was a history of deliberate segregation. And the city lawyer, who became a good friend of mine, was saying, This is Oak Ridge. We don't discriminate. We've never discriminated. And we got census data. We did all the stuff that you need to do to prove disparity. Lost in the district court, appealed to the Sixth Circuit. Nathaniel Jones was the chief judge on our panel.
Former attorney with NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
An icon of the legal arm of the civil rights movement. And one of the facts that we relied on were street names. And so the judge started with Lenny saying, basically, may it please the court. He said, counsel, we've read all the briefs. Tell us why you think there's a history of segregation. He said, well, on the north side of the main street in town, the streets are named Princeton, Manhattan, Rutgers, Northwestern. On the south side of the main street in town, the streets are named Fisk, Hampton, Bethune, Spelman. And basically, Judge Jones said, I've heard enough. And the city got up and made a little half-hearted argument, came back to Oak Ridge and settled the case by building scattered site development all over the city. And I think they did this thinking it would be spiteful, because one of the developments was up a hill from the rural legal office and across the street from Lenny's home. And they thought, basically, I think we'll show him. And in fact, it was an enormously satisfying thing for Lenny and I to leave our office in the afternoon and look up at this building with kids playing outside, people hanging up clothes on a clothesline, and just see families being stable. And that historically was really one of the, even though we did legally more tricky things, that was one of the most satisfying cases we had, because we built 6 scattered site developments all over the city for handicapped, elderly families. And it, still there.
And Oak Ridge, when it was being developed by the Pentagon or
right.
the military,
right.
was strictly racially segregated.
Right.
In fact, as I recall, married couples were not allowed to live together. They were all put in barracks if they were African American, not if they were white.
Right. They were what they call hutments, which were single sex. But at any rate, that was, again, one of the reasons why it was so satisfying to work with people like Lenny, to be in a position where we could see things built that would last.
Is this an okay time to write?
Yes.
Okay. Neil, you mentioned a moment ago, more than a moment ago, that you saw yourself as having 3 jobs as the executive director of Rural Legal Services. What were those 3 jobs?
I did litigation. I did fundraising. And then I just worked really hard to get the best people we could get and give them a professionally and personally satisfying place to work. I really, especially after I got to rural legal, I think really one of my strengths was the degree to which I could take pride in the work that the staff was doing. And I just made it my job to make sure they had good secretarial help, by this time we had computers and making sure that the computers and the copiers were working and the lights stayed on. And we had the kind of lawyers that were pretty much satisfied with that.
I'm struck by, but not surprised by the general theme that it wasn't about you. It was about enabling the staff of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me of a metaphor that our mutual dear friend and former boss, Ashley Wiltshire, used to describe his take on it, which sounds very similar, which was, he saw himself as the janitor, keeping the doors open, the toilet paper stocked, the supplies in the working, and basically being in the background, making it work for everybody else.
Right. Although I would add one more thought to that. This is a little bit harsh, but people often asked directors I would see around the country and other places how I was able to keep good people for so long. And the harsh fact was because I fired the people that weren't working.
In fact,
janitors don't get to fire people.
In fact, I think that became something of a special national specialty of yours, didn't it?
Well, it did.
Don't be immodest.
Well, within a few months after I started as director of rural legal services, LSC called me, the Legal Services Corporation in Washington, called me and said they were doing an evaluation of the housing law project in Berkeley. Just their annual, semi-annual assessment. And they want to look at what project could be doing in rural areas. You're in a rural area, you know about housing, can you join me? And I said, look, these guys are the best in the country. I don't know what I can do to help you. And they said, well, we want you to come. So I did a monitoring visit with an LSC team to what we call a backup center in California. And
what was a backup center?
The National Housing Law Project.
But I mean, what did the name backup center mean?
Backup means they were there for two reasons. But the primary reason in those days was to help provide technical assistance, information, backup, sometimes co-counseling to LSC field programs.
Legal Services Corporation.
Over the country. Right. And there was a housing law backup center, a health backup center, an education law center, and a sort of welfare law center that LSC funded. They eventually lost the statutory ability to do that. But at that time, it was a strong component of our national system. So at any rate, I did that. They liked what I did and my participation in it, and the people at the center liked that. And so I got invited to do other visits by the Legal Services Corporation. And then I started getting invited by state funders, by large IOLTA programs in places like Florida and Ohio that did their own assessments. And then the best thing I did was occasionally a single program or a group of programs in a state would ask me to come and do an assessment. And typically it would be 3, 4, 5 days. I'd put a team together and we'd talk with staff and clients and outside people, write a report. And eventually I got a reputation as the guy who will be very nice and gentlemanly and really critical.
When you actually had the reputation of the Grim Reaper.
Right. And before I ended that aspect of my career, I'd probably done 100 visits, some of them to the same program in 20 states. And I was responsible for the termination or resignation of 7, maybe 8 directors. And I just felt so strongly that our resources needed to be used well that I was just able to sit across the table from somebody and say, this is great, this is great, this is great, but you just suck and you really have retired in place. And it's time for you to leave. And I wouldn't be quite that succinct, but, and it was just something that people needed. The funders needed it, and the programs needed it. And there were other people. I wasn't the only one. There was a little core of legal aid leaders from around the country who did similar things, although they seemed to save the real challenging situations for me.
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, you're now on the Tennessee Justice Center Board of Directors where I work, and I just have to say, if the tone of this interview changes now and I become much more deferential, I'm just taking note of what you just said.
Well, I'm hoping the board will not be involved with staff relations.
What did you have any kind of overall takeaway from seeing, and you have, it may not be unique, but certainly highly unusual combination of very local, very specific, very geographically grounded public interest in legal services work, combined with this national perspective. What did you take away from that?
Let's see. Well, overall, I took a lot of pride in the national legal services system. And I really felt that a lot of legal aid staff didn't themselves appreciate what they were doing and just the incredible opportunity they had to get paid to do good. And I tried to, in addition to the odd termination, really try to give people recognition that they valued by having a good team of people whose views they respected, saying, look, this is just terrific and don't take it for granted and go out and get more money and do more of it. But again, the primary thing I took away was just the impact of legal aid on the clients, the regions they were serving. But there was also a lot of tolerance of mediocre work. There's a whole stream of thought in our community that since we're supposed to be good and be nice people, we shouldn't fire people or challenge them too much to be more effective. And I worked hard to try to get them to think that that was their job.
Let me go back to Rural Legal Services of Tennessee. You mentioned the Block v. Neal case, the Farmers Home Administration case. You all did garden variety work as well.
Right.
What sorts of other cases did you all handle?
We did a lot of Social Security work, and
this is mostly disability cases.
Mostly people applying for disability benefits, and either being turned down arbitrarily or not being given the right standard and the right due process they were supposed to get from the Social Security Administration. And we would, at that time, our district court judge in the Oak Ridge area was Robert Taylor, who we liked a lot on some levels, but who didn't like people to bring cases in his court.
He had a reputation for being expeditious in the processing of his docket.
Yes.
Peremptory, and dare we say autocratic.
Right. That's all fair. One time we filed a typical Social Security appeal in his court and accompanied it with a motion for summary judgment. And this was when we were in Oak Ridge, maybe 40 minutes from Knoxville. The date stamp on his order showed that he had dismissed the case before we got back to our office on that day.
This was in the days of paper filing where you had to physically take it, the papers, and file them, and it would get clocked in.
They don't do that anymore. At any rate, so at one time, we had 16 cases pending in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals.
And this was in a law office with how many lawyers?
I think at that time we had 5. And they weren't all Social Security. There were maybe a third was Social Security, some housing cases, some jail cases, things like that. But Judge Taylor just didn't like any of them. And we wouldn't take an appeal to district court unless we thought it was worth going to the Sixth Circuit.
And you mentioned jail cases. What kind of cases were those?
A variety of cases, some conditions of jails in local counties. And then we had a couple cases coming out of Brushy Mountain, the state penitentiary in our service area, where they would sometimes, the warden would do retaliatory things like, without any probable cause, require all female visitors to undergo a full body search and cavity search before they could visit.
This was Warden Clayton Davis.
I think that's right. Yeah,
he was he was a law unto himself.
Yeah, but we did a lot of local jail cases. I'll just digress real briefly. One of them was in Anderson County, where our office was based.
Is this the story that ultimately ends up in the Neil McBride Memorial Correction Facility?
They did build a new jail. I think they named it after a county commissioner, but that's understandable.
But you should have gotten naming rights.
Well, Lenny and Bill Allen probably should have gotten the name for that one. But the county knew it needed a jail. The sheriff wanted a jail, but the commissioners just wouldn't vote for the money to build it. And we got pictures of so we filed suit and then did investigation, had photographs that looked like they came out of the Texas detention camps, people sleeping on mats in the floor side by side, 30, 40 people in a room that was supposed to be a day room for temporary recreation. The conditions were just terrible. And the assistant jailer was sort of a friend. And we were in the jail one time talking with inmates, getting some more statements. And the jailer, who's about 5 inches taller than me and about 60 pounds heavier, backed me up against the wall and basically said, when are you guys going to quit screwing around with this case and file your damn suit? That was sort of the conditions we were working under. They were really on our side, but the county was fighting it. And I'll tell you one more story. I didn't see myself as a litigator. We had amazing litigators in the program, and I was an advocate, but I wasn't the one that was going to get the complex case through court. So we're getting ready for a motion for summary judgment hearing filed by the county on the jail case. And Bill Allen, who is the lead litigator on the case, and I were looking at the filing. And he had the photographs at the back of our motion in opposition. And I said, Bill, we need to put these in the front on the side of the file that we give the judge. And he said, that's not what you do. It's an attachment. It goes in the back. And it was one of the very few times that I just said, look, I'm telling you what to do. This is what we ought to do. And so since it was a motion to dismiss, we got to court. Clerk hands the judge our file. And the other side starts, I think some big Knoxville lawyer firm was handling it. Other side started saying, we know we need improvements. We're looking for ways to make things better, but we don't think it rises to a position of being unconstitutional. And Judge Taylor interrupts him. The little man sort of looks up over his glasses and says, Counselor, I've seen pictures of your jail. It may be constitutional in Turkey, but it's not going to be constitutional in Tennessee. If I were you, I'd sit down with these boys and figure out a way to get out of this case. And not only was, I was sort of happy about being right on the photographs, but in the years I worked with Chuck Morgan and Ralph Nader, we always used the press in a case like that. And the front page story on the News Sentinel the next day was the picture of the 30 people milling around, sleeping in this day room with a headline, Judge says jail might be constitutional in Turkey, but not in Tennessee.
You all handled some criminal cases as well, right?
We did.
Which is unusual for legal services.
Right. We just felt, and you were asking about relations with a local bar, we just felt that was part of our obligation. And for a while, we did that regularly. They usually didn't give us really complex things, but sometimes they would give us the nastiest cases. And
this was before there was a public defender system.
Right.
And so all the indigent defense was by appointed counsel.
Right. And so we did handle a number of cases, including one out of Brushy, which was a prison murder. And Lenny Croce handled that with private counsel assisting, but Lenny did most of the work.
And that was a jury case?
Yes, I think so.
And this, I recall the case. The homicide victim was a dwarf.
Right.
He was stabbed to death in the middle of a group of 20 or 30 guys that were all waiting.
They were waiting in line for food, yeah.
And the defendant whom you represented was a full-size, full-grown man.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Lenny got him off on the grounds of self-defense.
Yes. And he did that by really going into the prison and getting a picture of life in the prison. And we established that the victim was a part of a gang who had put out a hit on the person charged. And that if the person charged didn't kill the victim, he would be killed. It's not like a fight where you're blocking blows and avoiding knives, but in the context of prison life, he was going to die if he didn't do that.
And what year was this, approximately?
I probably mid-'80s, I think.
And just to set the context, at that point, Brushy Mountain was home to James Earl Ray,
right,
the assassin of Martin Luther King. It was the end of the line for the worst of the worst in the state prison system. It was the maximum security prison. It had been there in one incarnation or another, for 80 years. It had been running a coal mine within the compound until maybe a decade or two before that.
Right.
And it was utterly corrupt and violent. Just if I may, I remember going there and with a corrections expert who from another state, and he had testified as an expert all around the country in prison conditions case. And we walked in, there was free world money freely being used, and guards were paying prisoners to like shine their shoes. There were craps games going on in the yard. He was amazed. He had never seen free world money circulating in a prison like that, where normally it's script. And he said, without a doubt, this is the most corrupt prison I've ever been in, and I've been in a lot of prisons. That was the environment, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And we had a number of cases against the warden, against the prison. A lot of them were unsuccessful, but I think they moved the state in the direction that it had to go to reel in the staff and make it a little bit more safe for inmates.
Another anecdote on another, if I may, just on another tour.
Sure.
The C block was segregation. You remember that? And I remember this was a plaintiff's case that I was there for, and the guards proudly showed us their closet, their secret closet of batons that they used to maintain order there. These were not riot batons. These were like 6-foot bats. And that was how corrupt it was.
Yeah.
You all had some involvement with domestic violence cases. Can you explain that?
There was special funding for family law cases, and even before the special grants came in, it was just an issue that we thought was important, mainly because of the systemic ways courts and law enforcement treated domestic violence.
In what period is this?
We did it from almost the beginning, so it would have been like 79, right up till today. But courts routinely refusing to take complaints, people being let out on bond, no effort to control firearms. It was just a dangerous time for victims.
And as I recall, you all, I think Mary Maston and Brian Paddock brought a case involving a sheriff in, I don't remember which county it was. Can you talk about that?
I think you're talking about a Fentress County case. Again, where the officers just pretty overtly wouldn't act in the face of DV complaints.
Domestic violence.
Domestic violence complaints, yeah.
And that was just the culture that those were just not taken seriously.
Right.
And
right.
What was that case? Do you remember?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Well, as I recall, it involved a fatality, that there were multiple complaints, and this woman was killed by her ex-husband or boyfriend, and that rural brought suit against the sheriff that resulted on behalf of the surviving children, that brought about a real change in the culture, not only in that county, but I think among sheriff's departments generally, that they couldn't just shrug it off and say, well, boys will be boys.
Right. And again, the idea of using the press, whenever we had a case like that, we would do a release. We'd get it to the local papers. I was amazed at one big difference between practicing in Washington and East Tennessee was if your words were spelled right, mostly, they would run anything you gave them. And so we would do press releases on all sorts of cases, and that mattered more to certain types of defendants than a decision from the court would.
You have always been quite active in bar organizations and in making sure that you and your staff and your colleagues were fully involved in the profession. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it was just briefly something that I thought was important. I liked people to see legal aid out there and being engaged as lawyers. I and some other members of our staff who were president of the Anderson County Bar and of some other county bars throughout the service area. I really encouraged people to go to bar meetings and just kind of be out there as part of the community of practicing lawyers.
And were you involved also in the Tennessee Bar Association?
Yeah, I served. My last meeting was about 2 weeks ago, but I was on the House of Delegates for about a little over 10 years, which is the policy-making body of the Tennessee Bar Association.
And what about the ABA? Have you been involved with the American Bar Association?
Yes, I was on the SCLAID committee, which stands for Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defense. And that was the kind of the policy-making committee of the ABA on issues regarding legal aid and public defense. And that was a wonderful experience. I mean, some of the best public defenders in the country were on that committee, and law professors, judges, some other legal aid people who were just really committed. The bar, I don't think, has gotten, the ABA, the American Bar Association, has just always been overtly and quietly a huge supporter of legal aid. And I think they were responsible for sort of carrying us through some of the worst challenges we faced in Washington.
I believe you received the Ashley Wiltshire Award from the Tennessee Bar Association in 2011.
Yep.
And that's presented annually to an outstanding public interest attorney. You were on the board of directors of the Highlander Research and Education Center. And what was your first involvement with Highlander?
When I moved to Tennessee to work in Jacksboro, one of our main clients was a community group called Save Our Cumberland Mountains, which was the leading environmental group on strip mine issues in the state. And that was an issue at Highlander at that time. And then I did community development work with nonprofits. And so I and other people in the staff regularly did training at Highlander for the students and other groups that would come to the center for their 2-week training sessions and things like that. And did a variety of things with them and started advising their director on legal stuff, and then was invited to serve on the board. I think I was on it for about maybe 7 years or something like that.
Did you know Miles Horton?
I met him. I did know him. I helped Highlander a little bit on his estate after he died. Even, he was fairly old, not real active, but you could really tell that he was just an extraordinary person. He had a fire to him even into his 80s. It was a real honor to spend some time with him.
I want to talk a little bit about your TVA experience. You served on the TVA board during the Barack Obama administration.
Mm-hmm.
You were nominated by President Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And you served for how long?
About 4 years.
And this would have been which years, approximately?
2011 to 2014.
And this was not your first encounter with TVA.
Right.
Talk about your early encounters with TVA and with TVA board nominees.
Right. It was, I think, without exaggerating, there wasn't we didn't have the public engagement with TVA that exists now among a lot of different activists and community groups. And I was probably the leading critic of TVA in the mid-70s until the 80s, probably early 80s. And we would file petitions about rate structure and accounting practices and some technical things and some environmental things. And then President Ford nominated a fairly incompetent man from Columbus, Mississippi, to be on the board of directors.
He was credentialed, though. What were his credentials?
He was a bankrupt dog food manufacturer from Columbus whose wife was on the Republican National Committee. That was his credential. And so we basically led a national campaign, and for the first time got national environmental groups, public interest groups, Sierra Club, NRDC, all these
Natural
groups.
Resources
right.
Defense Council.
Right. To see that TVA had influence on national environmental policy. And then we got public power electric people and other people involved. And for the first time in history, and I testified before the Senate hearing on the nomination of James Hooper.
And this was during your time at ETRC.
Right. And he got defeated. Senator Brock stepped out, to his credit, and was very strong in supporting what we were doing.
Now, this is remarkable because you were perceived in some quarters as young lefty hippies, and Senator Brock was a conservative Republican.
Right. But a decent fellow. And he was really offended. He knew the importance of TVA, and he was offended that this guy would be nominated. And the quick story is he got defeated. After that, he sued ETRC, two of our staff members, not me personally, but two of our staff members, and the Tennessean newspaper for libel and slander and everything else he could think of, and asked for damages. Because of the cost of defense, we ended up settling the case for a modest payment to him, because when we investigated Hooper's background, some of the information that we got from business associates and others in Columbus was not as accurate as it should have been. I mean, there were some errors in our presentation of his business history. And so we settled, and the Tennessean, of course, could afford counsel and pressed on and got the case dismissed. in the process of dismissing the case, the local district court found that Hooper was in fact a huckster and a con man.
And you all did not have insurance, so you were bearing the defense yourself.
No, right. It was money that came right out of our operations, and we had to do extra fundraising and all that. And we really wanted to get back to work.
So fast forward to your tenure as a board director yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like?
I was really proud to be on the board. We had a diverse group of people. We really, there was a not very functional board for a few years. And at the time I came on, there were a few changes, and the Republican nominees and the Democratic nominees got along very well on most issues. And it was very exciting. And I was particularly proud in being able to help get the board's support for a global settlement of a number of EPA lawsuits over TVA's air pollution control and its control and its construction that I thought was important for the region.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but TVA was charged by northeastern states as contributing because of the way the airstream carried pollution from the TVA region northeast,
right,
to really contributing to the pollution in New England and the eastern seaboard. Is that right?
Right.
And you helped influence the settlement of that.
Yes.
And as I recall, before that, it was pretty much of a hell no, we won't go defense on the part of the TVA, when there was really no question about the facts.
Right. And they were slow both on emission control and on continued reliance on coal. And during the time that we were on the board, they really made some major changes that I think have regional, if not global, significance.
So you had a successful tenure on the board. The term was how long?
Members serve 8-year terms. I came in the middle of an 8-year term and had hoped to get another 8-year term, and was vetted again, told I would get it.
Told by the White House.
By the White House. And then it was withdrawn for reasons that are not and cannot be clear.
But were you, I love the choice way in which you were told that having been green lighted that you were going to be sent over for reconfirmation,
right.
then suddenly it didn't happen.
Yeah,
and how were you told that?
My contact there in the personnel office, it took him months to get things in position, which is pretty typical for appointees like that. And I got a call on a Monday saying, we're going to send your name to the Senate at the end of the week. And, but don't tell anybody. So of course I didn't. Told my wife, and that was it. And didn't get sent to the Senate, and didn't get sent to the Senate early the next week. And so I called my contact, who used the phrase, "I'm sorry to tell you that your appointment, the submission of your name to the Senate is no longer imminent."
And in fact, it never occurred.
Right.
And without asking you to divulge too much, you have a theory as to why that was.
Well, there's a couple theories, and anybody that is an active member of a board like that is going to have some people that are unhappy. And I may have had people who were unhappy who were in a position to do something about it.
Were you
that was an exciting time. And on a personal level, for no other reason than I met my wife through that process.
Maureen.
Maureen was general counsel to TVA for 10 years. And
what is Maureen's maiden name?
Maureen Dunn is her name. But the White House had told me in no uncertain terms not to go into the TVA headquarters for any reason, because they didn't want nominees to appear to be presumptuous. They wanted to be strict about following the Senate right to advise and consent after the nomination. And one day I just said, screw it, I'm going to go in and I want to watch a board meeting just to sort of see how they're doing things now. And the meeting I went to was the meeting of Maureen's last day as general counsel. And so the board was...
What year was this?
2011. And so the board was all saying nice things about her, and she got a little plaque and a little photograph and stuff. And her successor said, Neil, come here, I want you to just meet Maureen. So she and I met, shook hands, and talked for a little bit. And just, a couple of weeks after that, I just called her up and pretended to want to ask questions about TVA.
And so you did not literally overlap as her supervisor. There's nothing in this Me Too moment that we're living in right now where there's any impropriety in your expressing interest in her.
Yeah, and nobody would have objected to that more than Maureen.
Your first wife, Babs, when did she pass away?
2004. She had cancer that sort of came and went for several years and died in 2004. We were married about 32 years.
And you all had children.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about your children.
Well, my son, Alan, is now 37, and he's a PhD, after working and doing different things, is a PhD candidate in computer science at UT.
He's also a musician, an accomplished musician, right?
Well, he has a little CD and he plays the hammered dulcimer and about 3 other instruments. And then my daughter is an esthetician in Atlanta.
And their names?
And she is Bonnie, and she's married and has a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old.
And Bonnie's last name?
Is Demoto.
And your grandchildren? What are their names?
Are Kai and Cam.
And they grew up in Oak Ridge?
Yes. Yeah, they're the ones whose best friends were in play groups before kindergarten.
Just to go back to the TVA for a moment, what kind of orientation did you get as a new board member?
They were very thorough. They brought in national experts on rate making, conservation, power production, trends in nuclear power. I went to some national conferences on those topics.
Did you feel like the staff had a thumb on the scale in terms of orienting you?
A little bit, but not in an outrageous way. I mean, they certainly they wanted to do things as they were always doing them, but they really presented us, I think, the best authorities in the country on the areas that we were dealing with.
What are your outside interests?
I'm a swimmer. I swam in college, and
Competitively?
in college I did, yeah. And then sort of kept it up whenever I was in a position of being near a pool. And that's my recreation, my primary recreation. Maureen and I walk a lot. We walk a lot in Knoxville and have done 4 or 5 day village to village walks in France for several years. That's something we really, really enjoy a lot. And we have kayaks that we enjoy. We live on the water and can go kayaking before breakfast.
And
real pleasure.
And what are you reading these days?
Well, I'm afraid historically my reading is pretty trashy. I used to tell people I have enough nonfiction during the day to that I didn't want to read serious nonfiction books, but so I tend to read novels, Ann Beatty, Ann Tyler, trash detective stories by William Connolly and people like that. Right now I'm reading short stories about Kenya because we're going to visit there in August. But again, my reading is not what I would hold out as an example for most people.
You did your serious reading as an English major.
I did.
When did you retire?
2014.
But you still have some professional interests and involvements?
I do, yeah.
And what are those?
Well, my specialty was nonprofit group representation. And all those groups still have problems. And they don't have that expertise at legal aid anymore. And so I continue to help my former clients on a pro bono basis on tax issues and board issues and things like that. And then I'm serving on the board of the Tennessee Justice Center, which is one of my great sources of satisfaction now.
Is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd particularly like to make sure we cover?
I don't think so. It's sort of ironic, though, that a case that I handled after I retired was one of the more satisfying cases I've ever worked on.
Tell me about it.
It's the YWCA was very strong in Oak Ridge, with the Young Women's Christian Association, and they had a building that was a huge community project, the first big community project that was done in the city after it kind of came out from under the Atomic Energy Commission. And to make a longer story short, building got taken over by a person who was milking it for personal benefit, she was pretending to do things without doing anything, pretended to have a shelter that churches would earnestly support. And of course, they weren't allowed to go to the shelter to see whether anything was actually there. But so I put together the evidence about what she was doing, got the Secretary of State to dissolve the corporation, got them to take some other actions, and then got them to agree to appoint a receiver. And my reward for that was to be the receiver. And then I decided who to give the property to. And after fighting with the old owner of the corporation for years, I then fought with the local group I was working with, who wanted a local group to take over the building. And I made a decision to assign the building to the Knoxville Y. And they became a regional Y, changed their names to East Tennessee, or the Tennessee Valley, Knoxville in the Tennessee Valley, and have brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars in new programs, raised over $100,000 to renovate the building. It is a real showcase. It's back to being the center of a lot of nonprofit work in the county. And I've mentioned my pleasure in sort of seeing buildings built as a result of the work. And this was hugely satisfying to see this come back from really being a wreck to a kind of vibrant center for women and children in the county.
Sounds like you've had a pretty good gig, pretty good run.
I am pleased with almost all of it.
It was a good
Thank
career.
you.
It was a good career.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, so much. This has been a tremendous pleasure and honor. And is there anything else that you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I think you've covered it. And, in addition to Lenny's work, the work that you have done over the years has really been a model for what we tried to get out of staff in our program. And we've always appreciated that.
Well, thank you. That's high praise to be compared to Lenny and Rural Legal Services. This has been a pleasure, and thank you, and I think we're through.